Uttered December 7, 1941. The morning sun cast long shadows across Pearl Harbor as Seaman First Class James Mitchell polished the brass fittings aboard the USS Enterprise. Little did he know that at this very moment, 200 miles north, a Japanese strike force was preparing to unleash hell upon the American Pacific Fleet. The date that would live in infamy was about to begin, setting in motion a chain of events that would transform the United States Navy from a battered force into the most powerful maritime armada the world had ever seen. Admiral Husband Kimmel stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the peaceful waters of Pearl Harbor shimmer in the early Hawaiian sunlight. The Pacific Fleet's carrier force seemed invincible. The USS Lexington, USS Saratoga, USS Enterprise, USS Yorktown, USS Wasp, and USS Hornet represented the cutting edge of naval aviation technology. These floating airfields had been America's answer to Japanese expansion in the Pacific, but fate had placed most of them away from Pearl Harbor on that fateful morning. As the first wave of Japanese aircraft screamed over Oahu at 7:55 a.m., the strategic landscape of the Pacific War crystallized in smoke and fire. While the battleships Arizona, Oklahoma, and West Virginia burned in the harbor, a more significant reality was emerging in the minds of American naval strategists. The age of the battleship was ending, and the era of carrier warfare had begun with devastating clarity. Captain Frederick Sherman of the USS Lexington received the shocking news while conducting flight operations southwest of Pearl Harbor. The radio crackled with reports of destruction. Air raid Pearl Harbor X. This is no drill. The words that every naval officer had dreaded were now reality. The Japanese had struck first, but they had missed the most valuable targets, the aircraft carriers that would ultimately decide the Pacific War's outcome. In Washington, D.C., Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox rushed to the Navy Department building, his mind racing with the implications of the attack. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had already been briefed on the date which will live in infamy, but the full scope of American naval losses was still being calculated. What emerged from those first desperate hours was a sobering truth. America's Pacific Fleet had been dealt a crippling blow, but the backbone of modern naval warfare, the aircraft carriers, remained largely intact. According to the Naval Historical Center's official records, the attack on Pearl Harbor sank or damaged 18 American warships, but missed the crucial aircraft carriers that were at sea on training missions. The Japanese had achieved tactical surprise, but they had failed to deliver a knockout punch to American naval aviation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood this better than most. He had studied at Harvard University and served as a naval attaché in Washington, giving him intimate knowledge of American industrial capacity. His famous prediction that Japan could run wild for 6 months proved prophetic, but he also knew that awakening the American industrial giant would ultimately seal Japan's fate. As news of the attack spread across the American mainland, a transformation began in the hearts and minds of the American people. The isolationist sentiment that had kept America out of the European war evaporated in the smoke rising from Pearl Harbor. Industrial plants that had been producing automobiles and refrigerators would soon be retooled for the greatest military production effort in human history. The sleeping giant that Yamamoto feared had indeed been awakened, and its wrath would be measured not just in determination, but in an unprecedented expansion of naval power that would culminate in the Essex-class carrier program, the largest and most successful aircraft carrier construction project ever undertaken. May 4th to 8th, 1942. The tropical waters of the Coral Sea stretched endlessly beneath a canopy of cumulus clouds as Task Force 17 approached its destiny. Admiral Frank Fletcher stood on the bridge of the USS Lexington, studying intelligence reports that painted a grim picture of Japanese expansion. Since Pearl Harbor, the rising sun had swept across the Pacific like a tsunami, capturing Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. Now, Japanese forces were advancing toward Port Moresby in New Guinea, threatening Australia itself. Commander Robert Dixon adjusted his flight goggles as he prepared his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber for launch from the USS Yorktown. The morning of May 7th had brought electrifying news. American reconnaissance had spotted a Japanese carrier force in the Coral Sea. For the first time in naval history, opposing fleets would engage in battle without their surface ships ever coming within sight of each other. The outcome would be decided entirely by aircraft, launched from carrier decks hundreds of miles apart. The Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack, launched their own strike forces under the command of seasoned pilots who had honed their skills in the skies over China. These aviators, products of Japan's rigorous training programs, represented the elite of naval aviation. Their aircraft, the Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber and Aichi D-3A dive bomber, had proven devastatingly effective in previous engagements. Lieutenant Commander Weldon Hamilton led his torpedo squadron in a coordinated attack on the Japanese carrier Shoho, a converted cruise ship pressed into service as a light aircraft carrier. The attack unfolded with deadly precision as American dive bombers screamed down from 12,000 feet, while torpedo planes skimmed the wave tops. Within minutes, the Shoho was a burning wreck, marking the first Japanese aircraft carrier sunk by American forces in World War II. Naval aviation historian Samuel Eliot Morison documented in his comprehensive Pacific War series that the Battle of the Coral Sea marked the first tactical defeat inflicted on Japanese forces since the war began. The celebration was short-lived. Japanese pilots, displaying the skill and determination that had made them feared throughout the Pacific, found the American task force on May 8th. The USS Lexington, dubbed Lady Lex by her crew, came under savage attack. Torpedoes and bombs struck the massive carrier, but her damage control parties fought valiantly to save their ship. Captain Frederick Sherman watched helplessly as internal explosions, triggered by aviation fuel vapors, began tearing his ship apart from within. Admiral Fletcher faced an agonizing decision aboard the USS Yorktown as Japanese bombs exploded around his flagship. The Yorktown had taken significant damage, her flight deck punctured by a 1,000-pound bomb, but her crew worked frantically to restore operational capability. The battle had reached its climax, with both sides having landed devastating blows on the enemy's carrier forces. The evacuation of the Lexington became an epic of naval heroism. Over 2,700 officers and men were rescued from the doomed carrier, but America had lost one of its most valuable assets. The great ship that had survived Pearl Harbor and fought valiantly in the Coral Sea finally succumbed to her wounds, taking with her decades of operational experience and irreplaceable trained aircrew. As smoke columns rose from the sinking Lexington, the strategic implications of the Coral Sea battle became clear to naval planners in Washington. The Japanese advance on Port Moresby had been halted, marking the first strategic defeat of Japanese expansion in the Pacific War. However, the cost had been severe. America had lost a fleet carrier, while the Japanese had lost only a light carrier. The mathematics of carrier warfare were becoming brutally apparent, and American shipyards would need to work miracles to replace the losses mounting in the Pacific. The Battle of the Coral Sea ended in tactical stalemate, but it served as a crucial learning experience for American naval aviation. The lessons learned about carrier operations, damage control, and air group coordination would prove invaluable in the battles to come. More importantly, it demonstrated that Japanese forces could be stopped, that their expansion was not inevitable, and that American carriers could fight effectively against the veterans of Pearl Harbor. June 4th to 6th, 1942. Admiral Raymond Spruance gripped the rail of the USS Enterprise as the first reports crackled over the radio at dawn on June 4th. The most crucial naval battle in American history was about to unfold in the waters northwest of Midway Atoll. Japanese Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's striking force, the same fleet that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, was approaching with 4 fleet carriers and supporting vessels, intent on drawing the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive engagement. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey adjusted his plotting board aboard his SBD Dauntless, leading Bombing Squadron 6 from the Enterprise toward what he hoped would be the Japanese fleet. The morning had begun with confusion and missed opportunities. American torpedo squadrons had found the Japanese carriers but had been decimated by Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet had been virtually annihilated, with only Ensign George Gay surviving to witness the battle from his life raft. The Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu steamed in formation, their decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for a second strike on Midway Island. Admiral Nagumo faced the classic dilemma of carrier warfare. His planes were armed with land attack bombs for Midway, but reports of American ships in the area demanded a quick switch to armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for naval combat. This moment of indecision would prove fatal. Captain Elliot Buckmaster surveyed the damage to his ship, USS Yorktown, as repair crews worked frantically to patch the carrier's wounds from the Coral Sea battle. The shipyard at Pearl Harbor had performed a miracle, completing 3 months of repairs in just 3 days to get Yorktown back into action. Her presence at Midway would prove decisive, giving Admiral Fletcher a third carrier to deploy against the Japanese force. At 10:25 a.m., the tide of battle turned in 5 minutes that changed the course of the Pacific War. McCluskey's dive bombers, nearly out of fuel and about to return to Enterprise, spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northward to rejoin the main fleet. Following its wake, they found the Japanese carriers with their decks loaded with fuel lines, ammunition, and aircraft, perfect targets for dive bombing attack. Military historian Gordon Prang documented in his definitive work, Miracle at Midway, that the Japanese lost 3 fleet carriers in the span of 6 minutes, fundamentally altering the naval balance in the Pacific. The Akagi, flagship of the Pearl Harbor striking force, erupted in flames as American bombs detonated among the armed and fueled aircraft on her flight deck. The Kaga and Soryu suffered similar fates, their veteran air crews and irreplaceable aircraft consumed in massive explosions that could be seen for miles. In moments, Japan had lost 3/4 of its elite carrier striking force and hundreds of experienced pilots who could never be replaced. Admiral Nagumo, his flagship Akagi burning around him, transferred his flag to a cruiser and watched in stunned disbelief as the backbone of Japanese naval aviation died in towering columns of smoke and flame. The Hiryu, sole surviving Japanese carrier, launched a desperate counterattack that found and crippled the Yorktown, but her triumph was short-lived. American dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet found the Hiryu that afternoon and sent her to join her sister ships on the bottom of the Pacific. The loss of the Yorktown to Japanese submarines while under tow marked the 4th American fleet carrier lost since Pearl Harbor, following the Lexington at Coral Sea, the Wasp in the Solomon Islands, and the Hornet at the Battle of Santa Cruz. The mathematics of attrition were stark. America had begun the war with 7 fleet carriers and had already lost more than half of them in the first year of fighting. As the smoke cleared over Midway, the strategic implications became crystal clear to planners in Washington. Japan's carrier-based striking power had been broken, but America's own losses had been severe. The remaining carriers, Enterprise, Saratoga, and the repaired Yorktown, would have to hold the line while American shipyards worked around the clock to build the new generation of carriers that would carry the war to Japan's doorstep. The Essex-class program, already on the drawing boards, suddenly became the most critical military construction project in American history. The victory at Midway had bought precious time, but the war was far from won. Japanese industrial capacity, though inferior to America's, was still producing warships and aircraft at an alarming rate. The race between American shipbuilding and Japanese replacement construction would determine whether the Pacific could be held long enough for the new Essex-class carriers to tip the balance decisively in America's favor. June 1942 to December 1942. The massive shipyard at Newport News, Virginia, hummed with unprecedented activity as thousands of workers swarmed over the skeletal framework of what would become the USS Essex. Welders' sparks illuminated the night sky as America's industrial might fully awakened to the demands of global war. Henry Kaiser, the shipbuilding magnate who had revolutionized Liberty ship construction, now turned his attention to the more complex challenge of aircraft carrier production. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox stood before a joint session of Congress, presenting the stark mathematics of carrier warfare. "Gentlemen," he declared, "we have lost 4 fleet carriers in the first year of this war. The Japanese began with 10 fleet carriers and have lost 4 of their own. But their shipyards are building replacements, and we must build faster and better than they can." The Essex-class program, originally planned for a modest production run, was about to become the largest warship construction effort in human history. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, studied the intelligence reports flowing from the Pacific with growing concern. While Midway had been a stunning victory, the broader strategic picture remained challenging. Japanese forces still controlled vast areas of the Pacific, and their remaining carriers continued to pose a significant threat. The USS Enterprise, veteran of every major Pacific battle, was showing signs of wear that no amount of repair could fully address. At the Fore River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, riveters and welders worked in shifts around the clock on the USS Intrepid, the third ship of the Essex-class. The carrier's keel had been laid on December 1, 1941, just 6 days before Pearl Harbor, but now her construction had taken on desperate urgency. Every day saved in construction could mean hundreds of lives preserved in the Pacific fighting. The design innovations incorporated into the Essex-class represented quantum leaps in carrier technology. These ships would be larger, faster, and more heavily armored than their predecessors, carrying 90 aircraft compared to the 75 of the Yorktown class. More importantly, they were designed for mass production, with standardized components and construction techniques that would allow American shipyards to build them faster than any carriers had ever been built. According to the official Navy Department records, the Essex-class design incorporated lessons learned from every carrier battle of 1942, resulting in the most successful aircraft carrier class ever constructed. Captain Donald Duncan, assigned as prospective commanding officer of the USS Essex, walked through the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where his future command was taking shape. The carrier's island superstructure was being installed, its distinctive profile already suggesting the power that would soon project American air power across the Pacific. Duncan had commanded a destroyer at Pearl Harbor and understood intimately the stakes involved in the carrier construction race. The human cost of the Pacific War continued to mount as American forces struggled to hold the line with insufficient carrier strength. The USS Wasp, operating in support of the Guadalcanal campaign, fell victim to Japanese submarine attack in September, reducing America's operational carrier strength to just 2 ships, Enterprise and Saratoga. The mathematical reality was becoming desperate. America needed carriers faster than they had ever been built. At Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, innovative construction techniques were being developed that would revolutionize shipbuilding. Modular construction, where entire sections of the ship were built separately and then assembled, dramatically reduced construction time. The lessons learned from Liberty ship mass production were being applied to the infinitely more complex task of building aircraft carriers. President Roosevelt toured the Newport News shipyard on a crisp December morning, witnessing firsthand the industrial mobilization that would determine the war's outcome. Standing beside the hull of the future USS Yorktown, named to honor the carrier lost at Midway, Roosevelt addressed the assembled workers. "You are building more than ships. You are building the instruments of victory, the tools that will carry American air power to Tokyo itself." The psychological impact of the Essex-class program extended far beyond American shores. Japanese naval intelligence monitored American shipyard activities with growing alarm, recognizing that their nation's early advantages in trained pilots and combat experience would soon be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The industrial capacity that Admiral Yamamoto had feared was coming to fruition with terrifying efficiency. As 1942 drew to a close, the first Essex-class carriers were approaching completion. The USS Essex herself would commission on December 31st, followed rapidly by her sister ships Yorktown, Intrepid, and Hornet. The names chosen for these new carriers told the story of American determination. They honored the ships and men lost in the war's early battles, promising that their sacrifice would not be forgotten and their defeat would be avenged. January to August, 1943. The champagne bottle shattered against the bow of the USS Essex as she slid down the ways at Newport News on July 31st, 1942. But it was her commissioning ceremony on December 31st that truly marked America's entry into the carrier war's second phase. Captain Donald Duncan stood proudly on the bridge of the lead ship of what would become the most successful aircraft carrier class in naval history, watching as her crew of over 3,000 officers and men brought the great ship to life. Admiral William Bull Halsey paced the flag bridge of the USS Enterprise, planning the offensive operations that would mark 1943 as the year America went from defender to aggressor in the Pacific War. The arrival of the Essex had doubled operational carrier strength, and intelligence reports indicated that more Essex-class ships would join the fleet every few months throughout 1943. The strategic mathematics were finally beginning to favor American forces. At the Bethlehem Steel Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, the USS Lexington, named to honor the carrier lost at Coral Sea, was nearing completion. Her construction had incorporated every lesson learned from the early battles, including improved damage control systems, enhanced anti-aircraft armament, and better pilot-ready rooms. The industrial learning curve that had begun with the original Essex was accelerating with each subsequent ship. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, preparing to assume command of Air Group 15 aboard the USS Essex, studied the intelligence reports describing Japanese aviation strength with professional interest. While American industrial capacity was producing carriers at unprecedented rates, the quality of Japanese pilots remained high. The veterans of Pearl Harbor and the early Pacific campaigns were still formidable opponents, despite their reduced numbers. The USS Yorktown, second of the Essex-class, commissioned on April 15, 1943 at Newport News. Her captain, Joseph Clark, had served aboard the original Yorktown at Midway and understood both the capabilities and limitations of American carrier operations. The New Yorktown was 30% larger than her predecessor, with twice the anti-aircraft armament and improved radar systems that would give American forces crucial advantages in night operations. Naval historian Samuel Morrison noted in his official history that the Essex-class commissioning rate reached one ship every 6 weeks during the peak production period of 1943 to 1944. The third Essex-class carrier, USS Intrepid, joined the fleet in August 1943, bringing with her innovations that would become standard throughout the class. Her radar-guided fighter direction center represented a quantum leap in air defense capability, allowing ship-based controllers to vector defending fighters to intercept incoming raids with unprecedented precision. This technology would prove crucial in the great carrier battles to come. Admiral Raymond Spruance, victor of Midway, was selected to command the new Fifth Fleet that would spearhead America's offensive across the Central Pacific. His staff planners calculated that with 4 Essex-class carriers operational by late 1943, along with growing numbers of light carriers and escort carriers, American task forces would finally achieve the numerical superiority needed to assault heavily defended Japanese strongholds. The industrial competition between American and Japanese shipyards had become a race with civilization itself at stake. While American yards launched a new Essex-class carrier every 6 weeks, Japanese construction focused on the massive carriers Taiho and Shinano, ships designed to match American numbers with superior individual capability. However, Japanese industrial capacity was already being strained by the demands of fighting a global war against increasingly powerful American forces. Captain Jocko Clark, commanding the USS Yorktown, participated in the Marshall Islands raids of early 1943, giving the new Essex-class carriers their first taste of combat. The results were encouraging. The improved design proved highly effective in sustained operations, with better aircraft handling facilities and enhanced crew accommodations that maintained fighting efficiency during extended deployments. The human element remained crucial despite technological advances. American naval aviation training programs, expanded dramatically since Pearl Harbor, were producing increasing numbers of pilots and aircrew, but quality remained inconsistent compared to pre-war standards. The Essex-class carriers would need to operate with partially trained air groups against Japanese veterans who had been fighting continuously since the China incident of 1937. By summer 1943, the strategic balance in the Pacific was shifting perceptibly in America's favor. The Enterprise and Saratoga, veterans of the early battles, were joined by Essex, Yorktown, and Intrepid, with more Essex-class ships commissioning monthly. Admiral King's prediction that American industrial might would ultimately triumph was becoming reality, but the hardest fighting still lay ahead as American forces prepared to assault the heart of Japan's Pacific Empire. June 19 to 20, 1944. Admiral Raymond Spruance stood on the flag bridge of the USS Indianapolis, watching the largest carrier task force in naval history steam toward the Mariana Islands. Task Force 58, built around 7 Essex-class fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, represented the culmination of American industrial might and tactical innovation. The carriers, USS Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Franklin, Ticonderoga, and Randolph, formed the backbone of a force that would finally test American naval aviation against the concentrated strength of the Japanese combined fleet.
Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Japanese mobile fleet from his flagship, the supercarrier Taiho, as it steamed eastward to meet the American invasion of Saipan. His 9 carriers embarked over 400 aircraft, but Ozawa knew that many of his pilots were recent graduates of abbreviated training programs, lacking the experience of the Pearl Harbor veterans who had died in earlier battles. The quality gap that had once favored Japan was rapidly closing as American training programs matured and combat experience accumulated.
Captain William Sample of the USS Bunker Hill, newest of the Essex-class carriers, briefed his air group commanders on the morning of June 19th. Intelligence indicated that the Japanese fleet was approaching from the west, seeking the decisive battle that Admiral Toyota had promised would determine the war's outcome. The stage was set for the largest carrier battle in history, with over 1,600 aircraft about to clash in the skies over the Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, leading Fighting Squadron 15 from the USS Essex, climbed into his Grumman F-6F Hellcat as the first Japanese raids appeared on American radar screens. The Hellcat, specifically designed to counter the Japanese Zero, represented American technological superiority translated into combat capability. Its rugged construction, powerful engine, and heavy armament would prove decisive in the coming battle. The Japanese First Mobile Fleet launched over 300 aircraft in 4 massive raids against Task Force 58. But Admiral Ozawa's carefully planned attack encountered American innovations that transformed carrier warfare. The Essex-class ship's sophisticated radar systems detected incoming raids at distances exceeding 100 miles, allowing defending fighters to intercept far from the task force. More importantly, radar-guided fighter direction centers aboard each carrier coordinated defensive efforts with unprecedented precision. According to official Navy records compiled by the Naval Historical Center, American fighters shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft on June 19th alone, while losing only 29 American planes in what became known as the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot. Commander Ernest Snowden, directing fighter operations from the USS Lexington's Combat Information Center, watched in amazement as radar screens filled with disappearing contacts representing Japanese aircraft falling into the Pacific. The combination of superior American aircraft, improved pilot training, and radar-directed interception was proving devastatingly effective against Japanese aviation. Wave after wave of attacking aircraft were decimated before reaching the American carriers. The human cost of the battle fell disproportionately on Japanese forces. Veteran pilots who had survived Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and Midway finally met their match in the skies over the Marianas. Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, Japan's greatest surviving ace, struggled to maintain formation as his dwindling flight was overwhelmed by swarms of American fighters. The numerical superiority that Japanese pilots had enjoyed in the war's early months was now completely reversed. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58 from the USS Lexington, faced the classic dilemma of carrier warfare as reconnaissance reports located the Japanese fleet beyond normal striking range. Launching an attack would require his aircraft to return in darkness, a notoriously dangerous operation even under ideal conditions. However, the opportunity to destroy the Japanese mobile fleet was too valuable to ignore. The evening strike of June 20th became an epic of naval aviation as over 200 American aircraft launched into the gathering dusk to attack Ozawa's retreating fleet. The USS Hio, veteran of many Pacific battles, succumbed to torpedo attack from planes launched by Essex-class carriers. The supercarrier Taiho, pride of the Japanese fleet, had already been fatally damaged by submarine attack earlier in the day and was now a blazing wreck drifting helplessly in the Philippine Sea. Captain Jocko Clark of the USS Yorktown made the unprecedented decision to illuminate his entire task group with searchlights as American aircraft struggled to find their carriers in the darkness. The risk of submarine attack was enormous, but Clark understood that losing experienced aircrew was far more dangerous to long-term operations than exposing his ships to torpedo attack. His decision saved dozens of aircraft and their crews. The Battle of the Philippine Sea ended with Japanese naval aviation as an effective force essentially destroyed. The mobile fleet limped back to Japan with barely 100 operational aircraft, while American task forces had lost fewer than 100 planes total. The Essex-class carriers had proven their worth in the ultimate test, demonstrating that American industrial capacity had finally overcome Japanese tactical expertise. As Task Force 58 reformed for continued operations against Japanese strongholds, the strategic implications of the Marianas battle became clear. Japan's last hope for a decisive naval victory had been shattered by American carriers that were being produced faster than Japanese forces could sink them. The mathematics of industrial warfare had finally tipped decisively in America's favor. October 1944 to June 1945. Admiral William Bull Halsey gripped the bridge rail of the USS New Jersey as his Third Fleet approached the Philippines in October 1944. The massive task force included 11 Essex-class fleet carriers, their decks crowded with over 800 aircraft representing the cutting edge of American naval aviation technology. The Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Franklin, Ticonderoga, Randolph, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Hancock, and Bennington formed the core of the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought from October 23rd to 26th, would prove to be the largest naval engagement in history, involving over 300 warships and nearly 200,000 personnel. Japanese Admiral Soemu Toyota had committed the remnants of the combined fleet to one final decisive battle, hoping to destroy American amphibious forces before they could establish themselves in the Philippines. The stage was set for the climactic confrontation between American industrial might and Japanese desperation. Vice Admiral McCain's task group. 38.1, built around the carriers USS Wasp, Hornet, Hancock, and Cowpens, raced northward to intercept Admiral Ozawa's decoy carrier force. The Japanese had learned hard lessons from the Marianas battle. Their remaining carriers embarked only skeletal air groups, serving primarily as bait to draw American striking power away from the main battle. However, American intelligence had penetrated Japanese communications, and Admiral Nimitz understood the enemy's strategy. Captain Dixie Kiefer of the USS Ticonderoga supervised damage control efforts as his ship burned from multiple kamikaze hits during operations off Formosa. The Japanese had developed new tactics to counter overwhelming American numerical superiority, employing suicide aircraft in coordinated attacks that tested even the Essex-class carrier's legendary damage resistance. The Ticonderoga would survive, but her ordeal demonstrated that even the most advanced carriers remained vulnerable to determined attack. Naval aviation historian Barrett Tillman documented that Essex-class carriers participated in every major Pacific campaign from 1943 through the war's end, with several ships surviving multiple kamikaze attacks that would have sunk earlier carrier designs. The USS Franklin, operating off the Japanese home islands in March 1945, suffered the most devastating attack ever survived by an American aircraft carrier. 2 Japanese bombs penetrated her flight deck while the ship was launching a strike against airfields near Tokyo, triggering massive explosions among armed and fueled aircraft. Captain Leslie Garris and his crew fought desperately to save their ship as over 700 officers and men died in the flames and explosions that followed. Admiral Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58 from the USS Bunker Hill, watched smoke columns rise from Japanese airfields across Kyushu as his carriers launched round-the-clock strikes in preparation for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. The Essex-class carriers had evolved into floating air bases, capable of sustaining intensive operations for months at a time, their sophisticated logistics systems keeping aircraft and crews at peak efficiency despite extended deployments. The kamikaze threat reached its crescendo during the Okinawa campaign, where Japanese suicide aircraft sank or damaged dozens of American warships. The USS Bunker Hill suffered devastating kamikaze attacks in May 1945, losing over 400 officers and men in minutes. However, the carrier's damage control systems, refined through 3 years of combat experience, enabled her to survive and return to action within hours. Captain Joseph Clark, now commanding Task Group 58.1 from the USS Hornet, led the final carrier strikes against the Japanese home islands in July and August 1945. His task group included 6 Essex-class carriers, their combined air power exceeding the entire Japanese naval aviation strength remaining in the home islands. The strategic balance had shifted so completely that American carriers operated with virtual impunity off the Japanese coast. The USS Shangri-La, last of the war-built Essex-class carriers, commissioned in September 1944, and joined the fleet in time for the final campaigns against Japan. Her very existence symbolized American industrial triumph. While Japan struggled to maintain a handful of operational carriers, American shipyards had produced 24 Essex-class ships, fundamentally altering the naval balance in the Pacific. Admiral Nimitz, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, watched Japanese representatives sign the surrender documents on September 2, 1945. Behind him steamed the greatest naval armada ever assembled, including 14 Essex-class carriers that had participated in the final victory. The transformation from Pearl Harbor's devastation to Tokyo Bay's triumph represented not just military victory, but the ultimate expression of American industrial capacity applied to warfare. The Essex-class program had delivered on every promise made in the dark days following Pearl Harbor. These ships and their crews had carried American air power from the defensive battles of 1942 to the doorstep of Japan itself, proving that industrial democracy could outproduce and ultimately defeat totalitarian aggression. The mathematics of carrier warfare, so unfavorable in December 1941, had been completely reversed through American determination and manufacturing excellence. September 1945. The morning sun cast long shadows across Tokyo Bay as Admiral Chester Nimitz stood aboard the battleship USS Missouri, surrounded by the greatest naval armada ever assembled. 14 Essex-class aircraft carriers rode at anchor in the harbor that had once been considered impregnable, their flight decks empty of the aircraft that had carried American sea power from the ashes of Pearl Harbor to the very heart of the Japanese Empire. The transformation was complete. America had answered Japan's surprise attack with an industrial miracle that fundamentally changed the nature of naval warfare. Captain Dixie Kiefer, his face scarred from the kamikaze attack that had nearly sunk the USS Ticonderoga, watched from his ship's bridge as Japanese officials prepared to sign the surrender documents. Around him stretched an ocean dotted with American warships, testament to the industrial capacity that President Roosevelt had called the arsenal of democracy. The Essex-class carriers alone represented more naval aviation striking power than had existed in the entire world at the war's beginning. The statistics told the story of unprecedented industrial achievement. American shipyards had launched 24 Essex-class fleet carriers between December 1942 and November 1946, with 14 completing construction in time to participate in combat operations. Each ship displaced 27,000 tons, carried up to 90 aircraft, and embodied technological innovations that would influence carrier design for decades to come. No other nation had ever attempted such a massive warship construction program. Admiral William Halsey, architect of the Fast Carrier Task Force concept, reflected on the journey from Guadalcanal's desperate battles to Japan's surrender. The tactical innovations developed around Essex-class operations, coordinated air group strikes, radar-directed fighter interception, and round-the-clock flight operations, had revolutionized naval aviation. American carriers had evolved from vulnerable targets into floating air bases, capable of projecting power across thousands of miles of ocean. According to the official strategic bombing survey conducted after the war, Essex-class carriers and their air groups were responsible for sinking or damaging over 60% of Japanese merchant shipping destroyed during the Pacific conflict. The human cost had been enormous. Over 40,000 American naval personnel died in Pacific operations, many of them air crew launched from Essex-class flight decks. The USS Franklin alone lost over 700 men in a single morning, while kamikaze attacks on the Bunker Hill, Enterprise, and other carriers claimed thousands more. Yet these ships had absorbed punishment that would have sunk earlier designs, bringing their crews home to fight another day. Japanese Admiral Soimu Toyota, preparing to sign the surrender aboard Missouri, understood better than most the industrial mathematics that had doomed his nation. Japan had begun the war with a qualitative advantage in ships, aircraft, and pilots, but American productive capacity had ultimately overwhelmed every Japanese advantage. The Essex-class program represented industrial warfare at its most fundamental level. The nation that could build ships faster than the enemy could sink them would ultimately prevail. The technological innovations incorporated into Essex-class design would influence naval aviation for generations. Their angled flight decks, steam catapults, and sophisticated radar systems became standard features on aircraft carriers worldwide. The lessons learned from their construction, modular assembly, standardized components, and mass production techniques revolutionized not just shipbuilding, but manufacturing across American industry. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's leading ace with 34 confirmed victories, all achieved while flying from Essex-class carriers, represented the human element that had made American victory possible. The combination of superior aircraft, improved training, and industrial support had created a generation of naval aviators who dominated the skies from the Marshalls to Tokyo Bay. American pilot quality, initially inferior to Japanese standards, had surpassed their opponents through systematic training and combat experience. The strategic impact of the Essex-class program extended far beyond World War II. These carriers would serve as the backbone of American naval power through the Korean War, Vietnam conflict, and Cold War confrontations with the Soviet Union. Several ships remained in active service into the 1970s, testament to their robust design and adaptability to changing technological requirements. As the surrender ceremony concluded and American forces began the occupation of Japan, the Essex-class carriers prepared for their next mission, maintaining the peace they had helped secure. The Pax Americana that would dominate the second half of the 20th century rested fundamentally on the naval supremacy established by these ships and the industrial base that had created them. The transformation from Pearl Harbor's devastation to Tokyo Bay's triumph represented more than military victory. It demonstrated democracy's ability to mobilize industrial resources for defensive purposes while maintaining the moral authority that ultimately legitimized American global leadership. The Essex-class carriers had not merely won a war, they had established the foundation for a new international order based on American naval supremacy and industrial preeminence. Admiral Nimitz, accepting the Japanese surrender on behalf of the United States, understood that the Essex-class program had proven a fundamental principle of modern warfare, that industrial capacity, properly organized and directed, could overcome any initial military advantage. The lesson of Pearl Harbor had been learned and answered. America would never again allow potential enemies to achieve such devastating surprise attacks. The 14 Essex-class carriers that participated in combat operations had collectively steamed over 2 million miles, launched over 300,000 sorties, and delivered more than 100,000 tons of ordnance against Japanese targets. Their crews had fought in every major Pacific campaign, earning hundreds of battle stars and numerous unit citations for extraordinary heroism under fire. As Tokyo Bay emptied of warships and the great carriers headed home to American ports, their mission complete, they carried with them the knowledge that American industrial democracy had passed its ultimate test. The nation that had seemed defenseless after Pearl Harbor had built the most powerful navy in history, and used it not for conquest, but for liberation. The Essex-class carriers had vindicated American values while securing American interests, proving that a free people could outfight and outbuild any totalitarian regime. The final accounting was devastating to Japanese naval power. Of the 10 fleet carriers Japan possessed at Pearl Harbor, all had been sunk by war's end. American losses, the Lexington, Yorktown, Wasp, and Hornet from the pre-war fleet, had been more than compensated by the Essex-class construction program. The mathematics of industrial warfare, so unfavorable in December 1941, had been completely reversed through American determination, sacrifice, and manufacturing excellence. The sleeping giant that Admiral Yamamoto had feared awakening had indeed risen, and its wrath was measured in Essex-class steel.